The Indian Army was the principal army of India before independence from the United Kingdom in 1947. It was responsible for the defence of both British India and the princely states, which could also have their own armies. The Indian Army was an important part of the British Empire's forces, both in India and abroad, particularly during the First World War and the Second World War. The term Indian Army appears to have been first used informally, as a collective description of the presidency armies of the presidencies of British India, particularly after the Indian Rebellion. The first army, officially called the Indian Army, was raised by the Government of India in 1895, existing alongside the three long-established presidency armies. However, in 1903 the Indian Army absorbed these three armies. The Indian Army should not be confused with the Army of India, which was the Indian Army itself, plus the British Army in India. Organization. The Indian Army has its origins in the years after the Indian Rebellion of 1857, often called the Indian Mutiny in British histories, when in 1858 the Crown took over direct rule of British India from the East India Company. Before 1858, the precursor units of the Indian Army were units controlled by the company and were paid for by their profits. These operated alongside units of the British Army, funded by the British government in London. The armies of the East India Company were recruited primarily from Muslims in the Bengal Presidency, which consisted of Bengal, Bihar and Uttar Pradesh, and high-caste Hindus recruited primarily from the rural plains of Oudh. Many of these troops took part in the Indian Mutiny, with the aim of reinstating the Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah II at Delhi, partly as a result of insensitive treatment by their British officers. The meaning of the term Indian Army has changed over time. The officer commanding the Army of India was the Commander-in-Chief in India, who reported to the civilian Governor-General of India. The title was used before the creation of a unified British Indian Army. The first holder was Major General Stringer Lawrence Indiana 1748. By the early 1900s, the Commander-in-Chief and his staff were based at GHQ India. Indian Army postings were less prestigious than British Army positions, but the pay was significantly greater so that officers could live on their salaries instead of having to have a private income. Accordingly, vacancies in the Indian Army were much sought after and generally reserved for the higher-placed officer cadets graduating from the Royal Military College, Sandhurst. British officers in the Indian Army were expected to learn to speak the Indian languages of their men, who tended to be recruited from primarily Hindi-speaking areas. Prominent British Indian Army officers included Frederick Roberts, 1st Earl Roberts, William Birdwood, 1st Baron Birdwood, Claude Affleck and William Slim, 1st Viscount Slim. Personnel. Commissioned officers, British and Indian, held identical ranks to commissioned officers of the British Army. King's commissioned Indian officers, created from the 1920s, held equal powers to British officers. Viceroy's commissioned officers were Indians holding officer ranks. They were treated in almost all respects as commissioned officers, but had authority over Indian troops only, and were subordinate to all British King's commissioned officers and KCIOs. They included Subedar Major or Risaldar Major, equivalents to a British Major, Subedar or Risaldar equivalents to Captain, and Jamadars equivalent to Lieutenant. Recruitment was entirely voluntary. About 1.3 million men served in the First World War, many on the Western Front and 2.5 million in the Second. Non-commissioned officers included Company Havildar Majors equivalents to a Company Sergeant Major, Company Quartermaster Havildars equivalents to a Company Quartermaster Sergeant, Havildars or Daffadars equivalents to a Sergeant, Naik or Lance Daffadar equivalents to a British Corporal, and Lance Naik or Acting Lance Daffadar equivalents to a Lance Corporal. Soldier ranks included Sepoys or Sowars, equivalent to a British Private. British Army ranks such as Gunner and Sapper were used by other corps.